The fourth sequel. We are now going to look at the arrival of the missionaries in Buganda. And this is actually the area where the counting begins. When they arrive and you start counting 150 years, and that's what we are celebrating. So this is now the gist of these videos, of these celebrations. So they left the port of the city of Fredericktown, and then they went south to Bagamoyo. Bagamoyo was off Zanzibar on the mainland, and Bagamoyo was famous in the past for being the slave market, the biggest slave market center. Of course, slavery had by that time been abolished, and that's where it had very good facilities for the beginning of the journey to the interior. And so the journey to the interior began, and it was not an easy journey. Some of them succumbed on the way. They did not reach, they died because of the fever. The tropical, or the tropical fever. But then there was also another interesting story. The Baganda had instructed that any stranger approaching Buganda had to do so from the north, from the north of Buganda, from the west of Buganda, and from the south of Buganda. Those were the only strange visitors' routes to access Buganda. No one was allowed to access Buganda from the east. And this is very historical. It had to go back to many centuries earlier, when Buganda was conquered by a conqueror called Chintu, who came from the east. He came from the east, took over Buganda at the Battle of Buddo, and the last paramount leader of that time, Bemba Musota, was overthrown, ending a dynasty of almost 50 and more rulers of different generations. So the dynasty, which was called the Muwawa dynasty, or if you want, the Abasalange dynasty, came to an end, and a new dynasty, of which we call the Chintu dynasty, began. Why was it successful? Because they came through the east and conquered. So since then, history was written that any stranger from the east is very dangerous. He can end up conquering. So they were prohibited. And although the warning was not given so much in these words, there is a message that was sent to the missionaries that never use the east when approaching Buganda. And that's what they did. They went to Bagamoyo, then into the interior of Tanganyika, and then they reached at the south end of Lake Victoria, and then they crossed to Buganda. But they were very clever. They wanted to know how they will be treated first before they could come in full force. So the three survivors were T. O'Neill, Lieutenant Shergold Smith, and the Reverend Charles Thomas Wilson. Alexander Mackay remained at the coast. Engineer Gije Black had died along the route. The artisan Robertson had died at sea. The doctor J. Smith had also died along the way to the coast, while J. Robertson the builder, had also died and was unable to make it. So the only people out of this group who made it were to Buganda at that particular time were the Reverend Charles Thomas Wilson, the architect T. O'Neill, and the party leader, Lieutenant Shergold Smith. But however, on arrival at the south of Lake Victoria, they decided that Reverend Charles T. Wilson and the party leader, Lieutenant Shergold Smith, should proceed to Buganda so that the architect T. O'Neill remains at the island of Ukerewe in southern Victoria to guard their property, so that once the Kabaka in Buganda receives them, they can ask for permission to return to Ukerewe with some porters, and then they can ship their property to Buganda. So that was the deal. So they proceeded. The Reverend Charles Thomas Wilson and the party leader, Lieutenant Shergold Smith. And on the 30th of June, 1877, they arrived in Buganda at sea and were taken to Mutesa's palace, which at that time was at a place called Bandabalogo. So on arrival at Bandabalogo, the Kabaka received very well the two missionaries, and there is an artist impression of that event where you see only two whites with the Kabaka on his throne and the rest of the Kabaka's pages around. In that huge hut, you see an artist impression by missionaries of what transpired on that day. So because of that day, and when you start counting from that day, and you count 150 years, that will be on the 30th of June, 2027. It is just 4.5 years to go. The celebration of this 150th sesquicentennial anniversary, therefore, is on. We are celebrating early to create awareness and to celebrate the history of our church and to celebrate our church, the Church of Uganda, at 150. Now, when the missionaries arrived, and they impressed Mutesa very much, since they could speak Swahili, since they could speak a few Luganda words, and they explained themselves why, then they introduced Christianity to the Kabaka. They arrived at a palace which was more of Muslims, because the Islamic people had brought their Islamic religion in 1844 during the reign of Suna, Mutesa I's father. And so the entire palace were almost Muslims. But later on, Mutesa fell out with the Muslims and even killed them. As a matter of fact, as the missionaries were arriving 1 year earlier, the Mutesa had rounded up several Muslims, especially those who served in the palace, and killed them. It's recorded that about 7 of them were killed, although their names were not recorded. And this was in Emin Pasha's diary. Emin Pasha is that Southern Equatoria or Southern Sudan British ruler who posted this letter on which the advertisement that is bringing that brought the missionaries was published. So that envoy or those envoys of Gordon Pasha are the ones who made Emin Pasha record in his diary that Mutesa had executed some Muslims for despising the way he conducted Islamic prayers. For example, with shoes, refusing to face Mecca, and all those things. And so when they complained, he killed them. 7 of them at the execution's grounds of Namugongo. So that story is very true because it's recorded in the Emin Pasha diaries, although he did not take the liberty to record their specific names. Maybe he did not even get the names, but the event is recorded. Now, these ones are arriving 1 year later. There is that background of the Islamic religion with them. Secondly, the prime minister at that time was one called Katikiro Mukasa. He was a sorcerer. He had never converted to Islamic religion. As a matter of fact, when the Islamists fell out with the Kabaka, he converted the palace mosque into a shrine of traditional sorcerers. So sorcery was being practiced right inside the palace. Now the Christians come, they preach against sorcery and they also preach against the Islamic religion and introduce Christianity. That is the Reverend Charles Thomas Wilson and Lieutenant Shergold Smith. However, they now ask the Kabaka that they left their property at Ukerewe, south of Victoria. So could they return to the south and collect their property? And the king accepted. So T. O'Neill left, Shergold Smith left to go and find T. O'Neill, and they bring the cargo. And the Reverend Charles T. Wilson remained alone. On arrival at Ukerewe, the king Lukonge, or the chief of the area, Lukonge, engaged in battle with Shergold Smith, the Navy officer, because they wanted to steal their cargo. They didn't want them to take it away. Now, Shergold, being a soldier that he was, he fired back. When he fired back, it became a total war, and poor architect T. O'Neill was killed, and so was Shergold Smith. They both died, and their cargo was stolen. However, when this news reached Kabaka Mutesa, he sent a very big reprimand to Chief Lukonge, and he told him never ever to antagonize any European passing through his area, because if he did, he will face the wrath of him. And so it was. Lukonge never disturbed missionaries anymore. When Alexander Mackay finally passed through there, many months later, he was not disturbed, thanks to the instructions of Mutesa. And that was in November of the following year, November 1878. And this is where I need to make this clarification, because a lot of historians don't bring it out. Alexander Mackay took his time at the coast. He preferred to learn Luganda at the coast. He preferred to get more Swahili at the coast. He preferred to learn more of the interior when still at the coast. And therefore, he took all that time. Remember, they arrived in June of 1877, but actually not in June, sometimes in May, because they spent a month on the road. So they arrived sometime in May of 1877 at the coast, and he does not leave until almost September of the following year, 1878. And that's when he begins the journey. So that means that the sole missionary who was the real pioneer missionary is Reverend Charles Thomas Wilson. He was alone, he remained alone, his colleagues had been murdered, and so he was alone in the palace, teaching the king and his officials every day in the palace, and continued for all those months single-handedly. And that's why you see in one of the artistic pictures, there is only one Muzungu teaching the royals and officials. I think you see that picture. It's a very correct pictorial. It describes the situation. So Charles Thomas Wilson was really overworked. By the time Alexander Mackay arrived, the man was tired. No surprise, as we shall see in tomorrow's sequel. He almost left. After Mackay arrived, it was time for him to go. He stayed another 4 or 5 months, and he returned to England. So that is a clarification very important to make. Alexander Mackay arrived much later, although he left England with the rest, but he stayed at the coast. Now, with that clarification made, we can stop here for today. Thanks to the Lord for today's sequel. I'm Christopher Amos Chikomeko Ntambi. May the good Lord be with all of us.